Hello. So the project that I wanted to highlight is a painting project that I do with my drawing and painting students. We do an exploration of three different paintings in three different painting styles. So I wanted to first talk about what we have covered up to this point. So we have definitely talked about contour line, cross contour line, shading, value, um, and color experimentation. So, what we did was start with a value project. And in that value project, we did a, let me make this larger. We did value scales. So, we started with just pencil, or they could use a black color pencil. We did the black and white paint, of course, starting with the lightest, going all the way to the darkest. We chose one primary color, so that was either red, yellow, or blue. And it was based on what they wanted to do with their particular painting. So this was my example, which I'll show you more of in just a little bit. They had to do monochromatic tints and shades, and so I did red, tints of red, and then shades of red. So that was the first thing, and what came next was this particular assignment. So they actually are painting right on top of a photocopy, and they had to do a value painting, and then they had to do a monochromatic painting. So in terms of assessment, this was the assessment part of this, the formative assessment part of this project was definitely the value scale, the tint shade scales, and then they had to apply that knowledge into this particular project, which gave them a really good practice in understanding blending, understanding how colors work. So, of course, like the black and white was a little bit easier for them, and then they had to apply that knowledge of what's lighter, what's darker, and tints and shades, and apply it to a monochromatic painting. I want to show you a couple of student examples right before we get into the project that I want to talk a little bit more about. So this is the student's value painting, in which you can see she is doing some blending. She is recognizing the darks and the lights, and you can see the form. So in terms of assessing this project, they had to have all the range of values that they have on their value scale. And of course, they had to have the range of values seen in their tints and shades for their second painting. You know, two different painting styles or two different paintings were involved in this particular project. But it gave a great foundation in terms of blending, understanding how to make colors lighter and darker. From this assignment, we went into this contour line painting assignment, which this is the first year I've done this. And you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 different students, and they all kind of look like they're from different assignments. But this came in handy in terms of going into the next project, which I'm going to talk about in more detail in terms of understanding how to change colors. This is this one student, and I'm not going to show the preliminary work that they did. I just wanted you to see what they have done up to the project I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about. They understand contour line a little bit. They understand highlights, shadows. Um, Here's another example here. They understand how to change colors using black and white. They understand color schemes because that's what this project kind of dealt with. So here's a larger view of this student, and you can see that he is paying attention to highlights a little bit, some shadow areas. So in terms of the value scale and the tints and shades practice is showing up in this particular project. And then here's another example. I'll show you this one. So you can see the student again, where that assessment or that pre-assessment practice is coming in handy on this particular project, that she is starting to value to mimic or to create form and build form, paying attention to highlights. And then she took some liberty to do some experimental mark making in the background, which I'm all for. I loved it. So let's get into talking about a little bit more about the project that I wanted to highlight. So in terms of building upon the knowledge of tints, shades, value to convey form through color and paint, I think is a large undertaking for a first year painter or a first year student in drawing and painting. So we did a lot of assessment, pre-assessment, mini labs, and things like that. And this project can definitely be done in the virtual climate. My school is right now hybrid. So I have students at home. I have students that are in person as well. And I thought they did a really great job at home. One important thing is for them to upload as much of the progress as they possibly can. That way you are able to give them some informal feedback. So what I'll do is, make an announcement, students, please upload your progress, on this day, and they'll upload their progress. Most of them will. And I'm able to just kind of go through and just kind of talk to them, through the computer or, if they're face to face, but I'm able to give them some feedback immediately, which is very helpful. So the first thing we did, I showed them the orange that you saw on the previous screen, and they had to do tones. So they were looking at red, orange, and yellow. And I did that intentionally because they are still hitting the primary colors, red, blue, yellow. But I didn't want to set them up for failure in terms of, putting orange into blue. So red, orange, yellow, and then the orange, specifically related to the orange that they were going to paint. So this is a 6x7. So these are 1 inch spaced apart. These are 2 inch spaced apart. And they all had a palette. In person, they were assigned palettes and brushes for the semester. And palettes, y'all, if you have those old color pencil boxes, those make excellent palettes for students to be able to kind of easily check out, and it keeps the paint really moist throughout the project. So they had to just kind of go one by one. We talked about the colors wheel again, and I'm actually live painting with them for the class so they can actually see me mixing the colors and things like that. But of course, in terms of assessing, you want a slow progression of the tone changing into essentially the complementary color. And, this was one assessment that they had to do. So the next step came the oranges. So with that, they had to do 3 different compositions. And if they were in class, I cut 3 sheets of paper. I believe these were 4 by 6. So I'll show you these in just a second. But they got 3 sheets of paper. If they were working in their sketchbook at home, they had to create 3 different rectangles. And some of them actually took the liberty to cut the paper out, which, either way, it doesn't matter. But for this particular assignment, we're talking about painting styles because not everybody is a super realistic painter. So it's really important that students understand that they don't have to paint super realistic in terms of being a great artist. So this is allowing them to experiment with the painting style they might not have experimented with before, and also allowing them to experiment with more of that toning, value, tint, shade practice and assessment that they did in the previous project and before doing this. So this is also another assessment because it's assessing their knowledge of these tones and creating these little mini paintings. So let me go back and show you the orange just one more time. So this was their reference image, and this is, I don't normally, for projects, they don't have the same image, but since this was an assessment, it was important that they all had the same image. And then too, when they're posting their progress, they're able to see how their classmates are doing. Are they struggling with things that they might be struggling with? so on and so forth. And then it allows me also to see as a co-class, what I need to reiterate, what I might need to redemo, and things like that. So this was their reference image, and it was posted. I asked them to save it to their computer or phone or whatever so that they could have it out for reference throughout their painting. And then what we did was they had to do one that was focused on realism, one that was focused on using kind of impressionism technique, where they're more so using kind of a dotting motion, almost like pointillism. And then they had to do one that was reiterating contour lines, cross contour lines, contour lines. So you can see that these are all very different. And it was interesting to see students create these because you could see their interest was in one or the other. The one they usually spent a little more time on seemed like the one that, maybe they were a little more interested in or learning more about. So this was also an assessment, and what I did, of course, I was painting with them for the whole project. I always try to keep my palette on the screen so they can see me actively mixing paint. I asked them to start with the background first. So since we were all doing the orange, I asked them to start with the complementary color, or if they wanted to start with just black and white, they could do that. So of course, this opens up the dialogue for underpainting. So you can see I started with the underpainting here, and I told them not to worry about it being necessarily neat. It's more so about getting some paint on the paper at this point, because they can always go back and adjust later on. So on top of, I'll just start this one on this side. So here I am mixing the paint, and again, just trying to get some paint on the paper. And one thing that this opens up a great conversation for is the fact that sometimes we as artists, we as students, sometimes forget about the background. The background is like the last thing that a lot of people, artists, beginning artists typically do. So this is a great time to kind of re-emphasize or reinforce the importance of the background. Okay, so I'll let that dry. And this one is where I would start painting that or drawing that orange right on top. So you can either show them drawing it, with the pencil first, or you can simply, just start painting it with your paintbrush. And this is another opportunity, again, to reinforce that mistakes happen, does not have to be perfect. Allow the mistakes to happen, especially in paint, because we know that we can easily paint over it. Okay, so allow them to mess up. And I really try to, reinforce the fact that it's okay to mess up. Mistakes are awesome in the art classroom because there's a lot of lessons there. So what I tell them or ask them to do is just have, since we're all doing the orange, right? Ask them to mix in orange, and then I'll ask them to create two tones. So they have, we'll start with like a yellow orange. So I'm taking a little bit of that yellow, mixing some of that yellow into the orange into the yellow, which, dark into light is the rule of thumb when mixing paint. So here I have a yellow orange. I'll go with a red orange as well. So I'll take some of this orange. Let me make sure my palette is on here. I'm going to take a little bit more of that red. And you always want to make sure that you're telling your students to mix their paint ahead of time and enough of it so that they're not allowing their paint to dry while they're mixing paint, which we of course know with acrylic paint, it dries really quickly. So I have a yellow orange, an orange, and a red orange, and this is the same conversation I have with my students. So now I'm going to work on creating some tones. So of course, to tint or to tone orange, I would use blue. So I'm going to pull some of this orange here, and then what I'm going to do is take a little bit of that blue, just a little bit too much, and I'm going to make one tone of the orange. And then what I'll do is take a little bit more of that orange, and I'm going to take a little bit more blue to make a deeper tone. All right. So now I have my paint started. I'm going to start mixing. Actually, what I can do first is take some of that orange, a little bit of that white, and I'll make a tint. So notice I do not have black on my palette just yet. One thing I've noticed, and you probably noticed too, is that students tend to overuse black. So what I'll do is eliminate it from their palette initially, and I'll introduce it towards the end. So they try to understand that, when they come to the shadow or the shade areas or the darker areas, you don't always have to just initially use black. A lot of times you can tackle, and it's a more interesting painting if you use the complementary color. All right, so now I have my orange. And again, this is another assessment for students in terms of getting them or seeing their understanding of how to use the tints, tone shades. All right, so I have that orange. And this yellow, I've noticed, I did purchase a different yellow just because this yellow is very streaky. So students that were in person ended up mixing in a little bit of white, which did help. So one thing I'm doing or discussing as I'm doing this particular demonstration is getting them to understand that paint is a lot about layering, creating layers, working out layers. So hopefully they understand that just because they come in with an orange, that they're not done, that they're working on top of. So the next step, if this is going to be maybe my impressionism or my realistic painting, what I would do is come in and start to build the lights and darks, right? So now I can come in with some of this tint and I can start to lay out what's lighter. So I'm talking about like chunking, areas of the painting. Does not have to be necessarily neat at this point. Okay. And then just really having fun with it, as much fun as they possibly can. So, of course, the orange will be referenced. Right now I'm referencing my painting. But the orange will be referenced on the screen. And we're just kind of blocking out what's lighter, what's darker. I'm talking about not overusing water too much at this point, and just kind of laying in some colors to create the form. Not stressing again how neat it needs to be, but just laying in the color. One thing I've noticed, that's important for students to understand is that it's not going to be perfect right off the bat. So while I'm demoing, I'm talking about, perfection at this point, or really at any point, is not the goal of the assignment, but it's more so understanding how the colors work together. So this would be, this assessment actually lasted for about a good week and a half, almost 2 weeks before we even got into the project. So understand that assessment, is ongoing. It's a very important part of the art process because, with art, you're giving feedback. Students are experimenting, they're understanding, they're showing their knowledge, they're showing what they learn, which is awesome, in the art classroom. So again, this was the demo for the 3 different painting styles. So we had the realism again, the impressionism painting style, and the contour line painting style. So what came next after this was, of course, they submitted those, and I'll show you some student examples of that orange. So this is like a progress painting here for the orange. And you can see she did her background first, and she's just starting with the impressionism painting style, adding that in. So from the 3 painting styles, of course, they submitted those in. I graded those, gave them feedback. The next step was to start taking their still life images. So in class, and actually, for everybody, I took my computer back. I had an area set up with just a white background and some lights, just so students at home could, copy what I did. And I had some fake fruit in the classroom. And so I turned my camera so that they could see me taking pictures, moving around the still life, trying to make sure that the background was, what I wanted to be, or is eliminated, from any distractions that I didn't need in my final images. So I asked them to take 5 different still life images and then post those for me to see, for all of us to see. And then from there, they chose 3, they had to make 3 different thumbnails. So if they wanted to do, the same photograph 3 different times, they could do that. Or if they wanted to do 2, one photograph twice and another photograph another time, they could do that as well. I always try to ask them to do an odd number. So 3 or 5, or even 7, just because it avoids the need for everything to be symmetrical. So there's one student's thumbnail. There's another thumbnail here, which I thought was awesome, that she was paying attention to some of the cross contour lines to create the form. And this is just kind of a mini lab that we did in class. And here's another thumbnail here. Okay. So in terms of moving on, I wanted to show you guys some of their photographs that they uploaded. Students at home, of course, had some more interesting objects to choose from because, they're pulling straight from their pantry or, their refrigerator. So there's one, and this student actually was at home as well. And I can show you from there, they had to actually go in and start on their larger papers. So these are some progress images that were uploaded. And progress is an awesome way to, again, do some type of informal assessment because it's the immediate feedback. And here's an example of the palette, the Prismacolor color pencil box that I was talking about in terms of students using those for palettes. Underneath there is some palette paper, but they can also use like wax paper or even saran wrap so that they can reuse it and continue to reuse it. So progress picture, here's another progress picture, for another student, which she chose not to do her background first. And then another progress image here. Okay, so for the next webinar, I'll show you a little bit more of the final images for this particular project, and I'll talk a little bit more about the rubric. So let me switch back over to here as we conclude this webinar. So in terms of, again, assessment in the art classroom, it's definitely it can look like a test. It can look like, just a one-on-one conversation. It can look like almost a little project that goes on for a few weeks at a time or a couple weeks at a time. The biggest part for me in terms of assessing is making sure that students are understanding, how things connect, right? So with this particular assessment, before this came the tone scale, right? So in understanding or getting students to understand how this relates to painting these three oranges, was the biggest part of the assessment, or grading this assessment, for these students. Because in terms of moving on to the next step, which is the bigger project, if they're not understanding how to create tones, then they're definitely not going to understand how to use those tones and that knowledge of creating tones to paint these oranges. And if they're not creating the oranges effectively, then they're probably definitely not going to understand how to do the still life images. Okay, so that concludes this webinar. Again, my name is Sahira Dean. I will see you in the next session.